Oh, Sony. Besides possibly Nintendo or Toyota, Sony is probably what the vast majority of people think of when they think of a Japanese company. There was a time when Sony was like the crown jewel of Japan. You see, similar to China today, during the 70s and early 80s, Japanese products were seen as second-rate compared to their Western counterparts. This was because much of the West used Japan as a source of cheap labor to construct and ship off products for the rest of the world to use. So rather than Japan's current status as a major innovator in technology, Japanese products were generally seen as cheap knockoffs of Western-made brands.
No wonder this circuit failed. It says made in Japan.
This all changed, of course, but one of the major reasons for this change is thanks to an innovative Tokyo-based company known as Sony. While Sony as a company had existed in one form or another since the end of World War II, it started to gain international prominence thanks to innovative designs and gadgets. This includes early pushes into media technology, from inventing and helping to popularize the first video cassettes, to creating the portable music juggernaut, the Sony Walkman.
The incredible sounding Super Walkman.
Sony's success in all things media helped push Japan from a country known as a cheap labor force making knockoffs of already existing products to being the country known for designing and introducing new products. By the early 90s, Sony were major players in cinema, music, television, and much more. So it seems like it was only a matter of time until they tried their hand at the video game industry. What was famously started as simply a CD add-on for the at the time popular SNES, 1994 saw the release of Sony's first standalone console, the PlayStation. It is simply impossible for me to understate the importance the PlayStation had in the video game market. Its popularity eclipsed anything the console market was able to muster up until that point, selling over twice as much as Nintendo's previous attempts and over 3 times as much as the Nintendo 64, its competitor. The first PlayStation was not only my first console growing up, but shaped the childhoods of millions of kids worldwide, giving many of us our first taste of Japanese media. You see, the PlayStation was unabashedly Japanese. It was small, lightweight, and popularized CD-based gaming in the West. Before this, gaming on disc was something that was only popular in Japan thanks to the Sega Saturn and PC Engine. And its smaller size was also something fashionable in Japan, with most Western constructed consoles being big and bulky. This is why when NEC ported the PC Engine, known as the TurboGrafx 16, to Americans, they decided to bulk it up in order to fit in line with what they thought Americans preferred. The PlayStation even uses common Japanese symbols as its 2 major button symbols as opposed to the more traditional A and B buttons. In Japan, the circle and cross are commonly used as yes or no, and this is why Japanese region PlayStation games would have these 2 buttons functionally swapped in menus. But outside of the console itself, PlayStation games really weren't afraid to show off their Japanese heritage, both in its expansive library of JRPGs and other Japanese games, but also reflecting Japanese business practices. You see, in Japan, even today, movies, TV shows, animation, and especially games are made much more cheaply than their Western counterparts. I know when I say cheaply, that at first sounds offensive, but I'm actually saying it as a compliment. Japan's ability to focus on making games at a fraction of the cost American studios are willing to create means that Japanese games would tend to be more creative and focus on pleasing a smaller niche. This is why in America, many AAA games need to sell around 5 million units to make their money back, while in Japan, 100,000 units sold is usually seen as a huge success. This Japanese strategy doesn't just apply to Japanese created games either, but Japanese published ones as well. This is why the first PlayStation saw dozens of creative and innovative Western works ranging from Twisted Metal, the father of the car combat genre, to Crash Bandicoot, a franchise that seamlessly combined both 2D and 3D platforming elements to create a product that feels drastically different from, say, Nintendo's attempts around the same time. Compared to old man Nintendo, Sony really seemed like the hip, cool, and different alternative, something Sega tried so hard to become a generation before. Sadly, the success of Sony, the Japanese studio that could, would not last forever, at least in the realm of gaming. With the PS2 being the best-selling console of all time, it really seems like a no-brainer that the PS3 would also see great success. However, history shows differently. For younger viewers, it might be a shock to hear that the PlayStation 3 was one of, if not the biggest failures in console history, at least from a financial perspective. While at the end of its life, the PS3 was quite popular and even managed to eventually outsell the Xbox 360 in total lifetime sales, this was only possible thanks to Sony completely changing how they handled their gaming division and consoles from that point on. For the first half of the PS3's life, it was struggling massively. A lot of people want to attribute the PS3's early failure to its price exclusively. At $600, the PS3 was $200 more expensive than its competitor, the Xbox 360, and over twice the price of the Nintendo's Wii.
Presenting the console designed for the average man. The
PS Triple.
Any questions?
What does this monstrosity cost?
Jerry, what's the sticker price?
$599.
While I think the PS3's price tag did definitely hurt the console's early sales, I also think it was Sony's approach to the PlayStation that hurt it as well. From marketing, lack of early exclusives, and sadly shifting trends in the gaming market, people had little reason to buy the PS3 during its launch window. The sad fact is that the early days of the PS3 were a much more Japanese-focused console than the later days of it. In the year 2000, Japan made up an amazing 50% of console game sales. By 2010, they made up only around 10%. The PS3 releasing in 2006 was in the middle of this transition period, as the biggest releases stopped being Final Fantasy and Mario, and instead were now Halo and Call of Duty, cinematic and action shooters. The PS3 had its own shooter franchises, of course, starting with Killzone and Resistance, but it was mostly JRPGs that saw the system's early life. The PS3 didn't really start selling well until Sony cut its price by several $100s, and until big-name cinematic games started releasing for the system. What I personally consider the turning point of old Sony and modern Sony is the release of this franchise, Uncharted. In North America, Naughty Dog was sort of seen as Sony's flagship studio. Crash was the closest thing to a mascot the PS1 had, which helped lead to multiple similar yet creative franchises being released on the PS2, from Jak and Daxter, Sly Cooper, and Ratchet & Clank to name a few. While these games were Western, they definitely took influence from Sony's Japanese heritage. After all, Sony published these games, and really took the smaller but more creative Japanese approach to heart guiding their developers, especially when compared to the original Xbox, which by this point in time was going full dude bro shooter mode. But as described before, this strategy wasn't really working with the PS3. It seems Westerners didn't want what could be considered silly childish games, something Japan had in droves. Westerners wanted serious games, thus the famed Sony studio Naughty Dog unleashed Uncharted Drake's Fortune in 2007. A very different style of game from Naughty Dog. Its focus on third-person serious storytelling and shooting mechanics would become a staple to Sony exclusives from then on. The Uncharted series quickly became Sony's most popular franchise, and really did help save the PS3. But sadly, it also helped warp Sony's view of what games the Western world was looking for. So, the same year that Uncharted 2 released and became a huge success, Sony decided that Westerners wouldn't like a game like, say, I don't know, Demon's Souls? Choosing not to publish the game in the West, it was this decision that ultimately led to the Souls series abandoning its exclusivity with Sony. But at the time, Sony didn't really much care because they had bigger issues to deal with. Despite the PS3 eventually selling well, Sony was still losing a lot of money, both funding games and selling the PS3 at a huge loss. Sony was willing to take a loss during the PS3 generation if it meant they could continue the brand. Thankfully, their gamble definitely paid off with the PS4. The PlayStation 4 did not see the same issues the PlayStation 3 did. With a new pricing strategy and a Western gaming focus, the PS4 saw early success and continued to see success in every region except one, Sony's home, Japan. In Japan, the PS4 sold worse than the PS3 did. And this was to do, at least in my opinion, in large part to the major games Sony was making for the PS4. The Japanese really don't care much for cinematic shooters. Even Metal Gear, a very Japanese series, was more popular in the West. This is why, even when popular Japanese games were made by third-party companies for Sony's console, they would often release on both the PS4 and PS3 in Japan. Since, hey, more Japanese people own and still play their PS3. This is kind of ridiculous considering games like Persona 5, a game released in 2016, had a PS3 version released specifically in order to catch this Japanese audience. Rather than try to regain Sony's lost Japanese audience, they seem to instead decide to cut their losses and focus more heavily on Western markets. In 2016, Sony changed PlayStation's headquarters from Japan to San Mateo, California, and with it came an even bigger focus on Western markets. It was soon after this move that Sony started implementing policies that would really start to reflect California culture rather than Japan's. One thing that quickly made some fans upset was Sony's new censorship policy. It's no secret that Japan has a less restrictive view of sexuality than most Western countries. So to see Sony go above and beyond even their Western competitors in policing what could or could not be put into games on the PlayStation platform was quite surprising. This angered a lot of Japanese fans since it was seen as Japan bowing down to foreigners above the taste of their own people. It was quite a weird situation considering just a gen before, the PlayStation 3 was considered the weeaboo console. But now if you want to see mostly naked anime girls, you would find more luck with Nintendo, the famously family-friendly gaming company that had a long history of censorship itself. With the failure of the PS4 in Japan, we get to the state of how things are today with the announcement of Japan Studios, Sony's oldest and arguably most beloved studio in Japan. That same studio that helped give us Demon's Souls, Bloodborne, and many other great games. And it's not just shutting down either, their staff are being fired as well. Reports from Bloomberg indicate things aren't really going well in Sony's Japan studios. Mismanagement and a lack of communication are only the beginnings of the troubles for Sony's Japan division if Bloomberg is to be believed. Sony denies these claims, saying that Japan is still important to them, but it seems to simply be PR speech to me. Remember how I mentioned that in Japan, the circle and cross symbols represent yes and no in Japanese culture? And so the PlayStation traditionally kept that for Japan's version of the console? Well, that's no longer the case, as Sony wants to standardize the UI across all regions. This caused justified anger and confusion amongst their shrinking Japanese fanbase. And when I say shrinking, I mean it. Here is just an example of some of the sales figures coming out of Japan over the last few months. Nintendo basically dominates the industry. To quote a Japanese analyst, the presence of the Switch in Japan is particularly overwhelming. In the weekly sales rankings published by Famitsu, most of the top titles are Switch games, and Nintendo has practically eradicated PlayStation. It is unfortunate, but as I've pointed out before, the decline of the PlayStation brand in Japan has become a well-known fact. The hole Sony left is so large it has allowed even PC gaming to start to see a resurgence in Japan. If you want to learn more about that, check out the video I made last week on that subject. Now, I understand that there is an issue with these numbers. After all, there's a major shortage of the PS5 console, so it would have likely sold more in Japan if Sony made more units. But the fact that Sony was only willing to send Japan so few units compared to Western countries which sold an order of magnitude more really shows Sony's lack of confidence in the region, and likely indicates even more firings and closures of Sony's Japanese staff and studios. Things have gotten so ridiculous that now Microsoft is putting a bit of effort into trying to gain the Japanese audience thanks to the hole Sony left, a region Microsoft has traditionally done horribly in. Not that I think they're going to succeed. But despite the success Western games saw on the PlayStation in the last few years, I think it was a bad move in the long run to take focus away from their Japanese heritage. In the age of the dude bro shooter, I can see why Sony tried pivoting the PS3. But it is possible to gain both the West's and the East's market. After all, look at the Switch. It dominates both American and Japanese sales charts, yet Nintendo just had a direct where the majority of games shown were JRPGs. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't think Nintendo is perfect, and I'll likely make a video about them in the future. But what I see right now is the Japanese business model quickly regaining popularity globally. Series that were once only popular in Japan are seeing huge success statewide, and with the slow collapse of the AAA industry, companies including Nintendo have managed to make major success focusing on making smaller budget games. This goes in contrast to Sony's recent statements that they want to focus on less exclusives, but have them be higher budget cinematic ones. Sony has been able to continue getting Japanese games onto their system despite Sony's recent lack of funding, due to the fact that, until recently, there wasn't a lot of other options for Japanese devs if they wanted a system to sell their games on. But as has been shown, that is no longer the case. If Sony continues forgetting about their Japanese fanbase, their Japanese catalog of games will only continue to shrink. This is bad for multiple reasons, but one of them is because Japanese games don't just sell well in Japan anymore. I will always look fondly on the PlayStation. It didn't just introduce me to gaming, it introduced me to a glimpse of Japanese culture to begin with. Without the PlayStation, I would have likely never developed the love for so many obscure Japanese franchises, nor would I have likely made this channel to begin with. In closing, even if Sony never treats Japan like they used to, the PlayStation was just a box to play games on. If I try to take off my nostalgia goggles, I can see that the Japanese haven't stopped making great games. They're just a bit more spread out now, across a few different boxes. And maybe that's a good thing in the long run. See ya.